All right, so we're going to shift our um, podcast for LD to a more like specific discussion system because honestly, I'm running out of ideas for some of these podcasts. And then we still got to get another 12 out there. Um, so what we're going to do for at least like a handful of the ones remaining is we're just going to have a like really in-depth discussion about the specific arguments under this new topic, the one that is resolved states ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. Um, I have not done the like most amount of research on this topic that I have ever done. I've definitely done some, and I will have some like background information about most of these arguments. But generally, these discussions, because they're going to be done, like I said, on multiple videos, is going to be my general thoughts on the arguments, once re-explaining what they are, because we've already talked about them a little bit in like other forums, possibly what values and criterions could go well within those types of big ideas to help you just get a better feel on what's going on with the argument, whether or not you'd like to use it in your case, where you can go with the argument, and so on and so forth. So I really don't think there's too much we have to do to explain this one and get ready for it. So why don't we just jump right into it? Today we're going to be talking about escalation, which is an argument that is generally going to be used on this topic on the affirmative side, which is going to argue that lethal autonomous weapons lead to a greater degree of escalation and will therefore cause like more wars and stuff. So kind of like explaining the thought process behind this argument, there are several different warrants that can lead to this like escalation impact. But the most common one is going to be miscalculation. This is something that if you debated last year, if you're not a novice, then you'll remember this argument under the nuclear weapons topic probably. But essentially the argument behind this is that there's some error whenever we're like in war, right? So under like the nuclear weapons topics, it was often things like perceived threats, which would then lead to like more nuclear launches. In this case, the miscalculation is going to be a tad different because the whole point is that there's no human interaction, which then just obviously like lends itself to miscalculation very easily. To argue that we're going to have these perfect systems is somewhat faulty because obviously it's not like artificial intelligence, right? We can teach these machines to become very intelligent, but they follow a code, and if that programming doesn't serve us in this like situations perfectly well, then it's going to lead to like a miscalculated attack and more lives lost. Even if you use things like drones and consider that lethal autonomous weapons, there still could be times whenever we program the drone incorrectly and it does an attack wrong or whatever. And the fact that there is no human interaction is going to make it to where these are usually going to be carried through. That was the biggest thing with the nuclear weapons argument, is that there were a lot of close calls with nuclear weapons, but they were always stopped because people were able to intervene and prevent the error from actually like resulting in the launch of nuclear warheads. But if like the technology messes up here, that's the end, right? Because it's just the technology. That's the only thing that's giving any actual influence to these machines and like the attacks. So that's like the general basis on the miscalculation part of it. And obviously, if we attack a country like unjustly, let's say that like we accidentally like shoot down a Russian plane or something, or a Chinese plane or whatever type of attack we can have, that's going to obviously anger that country and can therefore help lead to any type of conflict. Generally, obviously, it's going to be like conventional warfare, right? People are going to argue that it's going to lead to like a counterattack. And obviously, there's a lot of trying to think of like this claim is justified, right? Even if we look back at January, although nothing came of it, there was a lot of fears following Trump's attack on that Qasem Soleimani, one of the Iranian generals, because people were afraid that like Iran was going to come back and like try and avenge him. That's not quite the words I'm looking for, but reciprocate the attack and come back at us, which is then going to make things escalate and lead to an actual war. Obviously, it is not resolute, and it's a good example of like when an error, well, not an error, but when an attack can happen and there is no counterattack. So obviously, this argument isn't completely perfect, like it's foolproof in that like regard. But obviously, like eventually, there's going to be some reciprocation, and it's going to lead to warfare. Another like addition to this argument that I've already seen in the briefs is that it's going to lead to nuclear warfare. Now, this is just mainly because it's an easy link, right? And because in the national circuit, just like in policy, if you can link it back to nuclear warfare, that's great for you. I personally think, like generally in LD, trying to link, like traditional LD at least, trying to link it to nuclear warfare is a stretch. Obviously, under the nuclear weapons topic, that was like the whole point. But trying to get that here, that's not really like a good, it's just not really believable. Even if you have good evidence, then people are going to be like, I don't really see it. But in this case, the argument is just saying that it's going to lead to a nuclear attack instead of like a conventional warfare attack. So if you want to have your like nuclear impacts, then you can definitely go down that route. I personally would not recommend it, but it's available to you there. So right off the bat, like the value and value criterions we're going to be seeing with this is going to be definitely a consequentialist one. You could just generally talk about like maximizing well-being and just like utilitarianism, protecting lives, those types of things. You could also just talk about things like human rights if you want to like. I don't think that this contention would lead me to argue for human rights. But if you had another contention that fit under that criterion really well, then you could pair this with that contention and it would still help achieve that criterion. Because honestly, that's one of the things you have to think about when choosing a criterion and also obviously when choosing your contentions, is that sometimes the contentions are arguing like wildly different things. So you have to try and find like a common value criterion that can work. And obviously most of the time you can probably just default to utilitarianism, but I try and avoid that one just because like it's definitely great, and if you're a novice, I would recommend using it basically every case. But I'm not the type of person to do like tricky arguments made to confuse my opponent, but also I know that they're going to have the same pre-written responses to utilitarianism every single time. So that's why I personally don't really opt for it. But anyway, generally you have a good like amount of options for this value and criterion under this argument, and I think you'll be like fine whenever you're picking one. I don't think it's really going to help or hinder you in any way, depending on like what value criterion you choose for this argument specifically. Some responses to this argument right off the bat are going to be things such as like you can attack the link and say that miscalculation isn't going to result in like these acts of war, and you could point to things like we talked about with the Iranian general where it didn't actually happen because like countries don't want to go to war. Unfortunately here we don't have much of a deterrence argument, which was something that was very helpful under the nuclear weapons topic, which was that the fact that we had nuclear weapons could actually like deter conventional warfare. Now you could still talk about that a little bit. You could talk about how nuclear armed nations simply don't attack. Who actually, that's something I just thought of. I just kind of had a revelation right here. I think there's a lot of moving pieces in this argument, which might make it a rough rebuttal. But no nuclear armed nation has really attacked each other like ever. We've had proxy wars and like the Korean War and the Vietnam and those types of things. And we've also had like small skirmishes like Argentina and Falklands, which were held by Britain. So they have nuclear weapons. So there's some small stuff here and there, but you could just talk about how it's like the countries who are going to have lethal autonomous weapons are going to be the ones that also have nuclear weapons. And these are going to be reasons why they're not going to attack each other, even if there is miscalculation, because they don't want to result in nuclear escalation. I personally kind of like that argument, but I'm not sure if you could really work it into a round. I'll have to mull that one over myself. Like I said, I just thought of it here. So I also had another one while I was going on that little tangent. I think personally, if you are going to try and opt for, like if someone opts for the nuclear argument, then you can go through and say that like that's just unfeasible, like we already kind of talked about. The bigger one that I was just thinking of is that you could actually turn this by saying that these autonomous weapons are going to result in less miscalculation because there isn't human error present there. Like, you could argue that human error is what's causing these issues, and that if we don't have to deal with it, then it's like, oh, we're going to be fine. I think you're definitely going to need to find some evidence to like support that, because it sounds good, but like if your opponent's reading evidence that says that these autonomous weapons are going to result in errors, then like I think you could just straight up make that argument, but it's not going to be overly convincing, even to someone like me who really is okay with not reading evidence in the rebuttals. That's just kind of a strong claim, so to not read evidence on it is not overly convincing. But generally, I think if you can get that argument down and you can find some evidence, I think that's the rebuttal to go with. Like, obviously, turns are always the best, and literally just being like, you make miscalculation worse, and then you can access all of their impacts. That's a good one, I think, personally. Because I'm assuming I'm going to see this argument in some of my rounds. That's probably going to be the response I use to it. So, that's a good one to use personally. But otherwise, I think those are the main arguments we shouldn't really need to talk about. So that's all we really have to talk about for escalation in general. But as always, I hope this video was educational to you guys, and I wish you guys good luck in all your rounds.